morning. Today I'll be presenting joint work with my collaborators at CMU, where we evaluate how Starlink fits into different policy that aims to expand connectivity and improve internet access equity. So, bringing internet connectivity to hard to reach places is a physically challenging problem for a variety of reasons. Some of these include rugged terrain. As an example, the Indian Army had to face brutal weather when installing fiber on a glacier. Societal instability. Local telcos in South Africa have had to partner with the police force to prevent infrastructure vandalism. Natural disasters. The entirety of Tonga was cut off from the rest of the world last year because of a volcanic eruption that severed a subsea cable. And remoteness, where Google has invested several millions of dollars to lay subsea cables to improve connectivity for island nations in the Pacific. Yet, despite it being such a challenging and expensive problem, governments have long cared about the connectivity issue. And the stats have shown internet connectivity has significant effects both on income and quality of life. And today we're at an interesting time here because new low Earth orbiting satellite networks, or LEOs, can help solve these important but challenging connectivity goals. And so by going directly to space, LEO networks are able to bypass some of the challenges of rough terrain. And since we no longer rely on hyperlocal infrastructure, we are more resilient to localized effects from natural disasters and vulnerabilities to vandalism. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into how LEOs work. And the first part is the dish, and the dish transmits user packets to the satellite. And as of right now, Starlink has deployed thousands of these satellites orbiting at low altitude in space. I want to highlight that these satellite networks are very dynamic. In fact, there's a global scheduler that runs every 15 seconds to reassign satellites to a dish because they're constantly going in and out of range. And then we have the ground station, which is a downlink for the satellites. And finally, the points of presence, or the POPs, which are terrestrial facilities where Starlink can peer with other ISPs to connect user traffic to the rest of the internet. And so putting all this together, if a user sends a request to fetch a website, the path would travel to the router to the dish, up to space, and directly back down to a ground station, and finally appear with the rest of the internet to complete its request. And I want to bring attention to new technology called inter-satellite links, or ISLs, which are particularly relevant for connecting remote users. So let's say a user is on a boat in the middle of the Pacific and wants to fetch that same website. All is the same, except sometimes a ground station may not be reachable within one satellite. And so inter-satellite links are so powerful because they enable users to reach distant ground stations since they can relay packets between one another. So this way, the user's packets can traverse an ISL to reach the ground station and finally get forwarded to fetch its website. So given the potential of LEO networks, it's natural to wonder how might governments respond to LEO deployments? And we observe two main paths in current initiatives. The first is through subsidies, and the second is through investment in deployment of national LEO infrastructure, with a similar goal of increasing domestic access, but additional goals of expanding their sphere of influence and matters of national security. And we know that policymakers are considering these questions about subsidies and deployment already. And my goal is not to address all of these complexities of those questions or even advocate for a particular strategy. Instead, I'd like to just provide the technical data from my research to bring nuance to how you, the policymakers, consider those questions. So to answer these questions, we combine real-world measurements, which we mostly pull from Google's MLab NDT speed test dataset, as well as simulated data for what-if analysis. In fact, we actually extend an existing simulator called Hypatia and use a crowdsourced gateway dataset and Starlink FCC filings as parameters in this simulator. And so coming back to these two threats, let's first focus on policy that aims to subsidize commercial networks. And we explore three major initiatives that might lead to subsidies. The first is BEAD in the US, the CEBF, or Connecting Europe Broadband Fund in the EU, and the Statutory Infrastructure Provider Regime in Australia. And we pose two key questions for these initiatives. One, do LEOs meet standards of quality? And two, does Starlink perform as well for low-income users as for high-income users? So let's dive into this first question. For each of these policies, we looked at speed test samples in each nation and measured what percent of those samples meet their respective benchmarks of their aforementioned policy. And we find that at least when looking at average case throughput, that Starlink does not regularly meet BEAD goals in the US, with only 24.7% of samples over the 100 megabits per second threshold. The same is true in the EU with only 13.6% of samples. In Australia, however, we see almost 100% of samples meeting its threshold. However, its regulators are now considering increasing their minimum legislated speeds to 100 megabits per second to match the EU and US. And when we look at 100 megabits per second, we actually find that the average case throughput falls to roughly 40% of samples over that new threshold. Another detail I want to call out is the difference in peak versus average case throughput. The language of BEAD states that it wants at least 100 megabits per second for download, whereas the SIP language states that it wants a peak download speed of at least 25. And so clearly from this graph, there's a strong distinction between peak versus average case, which is very important to LEO due to its volatile nature. And this volatile nature occurs because LEOs are more susceptible to loss due to several physical factors, one of which includes transmission via radio waves. And these radio signals can be weakened due to a variety of factors, including weather, obstructions, and distance. On the other hand, another aspect that contributes to loss is satellite dynamics. So as mentioned previously, it's very dynamic where satellites are going in and out of range. And so this handoff that happens in between satellites can also be a source of packet loss that adds volatility to the network. And so we find that the volatile nature of LEO may warrant a reframing of performance goals, where in the US and EU, we see that we sometimes meet those goals, and in Australia, we often meet those performance goals. However, all of these findings are simply up to the interpretation of these proposed standards. And we hope that these findings bring insights when considering whether LEO operators should be eligible for broadband subsidies and how we can define standards to account for the volatile nature of LEO networks. And so we saw that Starlink meets standards only some of the time, and often infrastructure deployments have some economic bias. And so if Starlink shows the same bias as other platforms, it might not be useful to beat objectives if we're only reaching high-income regions. And thus, we explore, does Starlink perform as well for low-income users as it does for high-income users? And luckily, we find that this is not the case at all. And so we isolate this analysis to the US and identify the county and median income of that county for each NDT sample and look specifically at the bottom and top 10%. And we find that for non-Starlink providers, there's significant difference in median throughput, jumping from 156 to 203 megabits per second, about a 30% change. However, when compared to Starlink, we find that this median is actually slightly lower. And so this suggests that Starlink throughput is perhaps more equitable across regions of differing income. And thus, we find that Starlink actually shows promise on the note of equity. And we find that this larger service radius of Starlink enables users in lower income regions to benefit from infrastructure in more affluent areas. And we call this the neighbor effect, which we describe in further detail in our paper. And this neighbor effect is an important quality of LEO networks in regards to internet access and may be useful when considering whether subsidies are necessary if commercial operators are able to provide connectivity in policy's target regions. And so now let's look at investments in deployment of national LEO infrastructure. And here we explore two LEO deployment initiatives, IRIS from the EU and Thousand Sails in China. And we pose one question. Does Starlink complement or compete with targeted coverage areas of these initiatives? And so let's get into IRIS. One of the connectivity goals of IRIS is to put an end to dead zones in Europe, as well as the whole of Africa, using the constellation's north-south orbits. But when we look at availability data, we find that Starlink in its current state is not available in a majority of African countries. In fact, it's only available in 35% of them. And so we reframe this question to ask, how does potential Starlink coverage complement or compete with coverage areas of IRIS? And we find that Starlink can actually potentially cover a majority of Africa. And we get this data using our simulation over a 30-minute window of Starlink coverage, assuming full deployment of ISLs. And we find that ISLs have the potential to increase reachability from only 11% of Africa being constantly reachable over that 30-minute window to 81% when enabling single ISL traversals. And so our findings show that Starlink in its current state complements the goals of IRIS, but may compete in the near future. However, this hypothesized future depends on commercial action, and even if they have infrastructure to support users, government regulations may also stall Starlink coverage. And thus, we hope that these nuances add more insights when policymakers consider whether national efforts are worth investment, even if they replicate availability. And finally, let's look at Thousand Sails in China. And since it's in its initial phase, we have to approximate its target regions. So we know that Thousand Sails belongs to the Space Information Corridor of China. And one of the goals of this corridor is to provide service for the Belt and Road Initiative countries. Thus, we use these Belt and Road Initiative countries as a proxy for Thousand Sails area of interest. And here we discover a potential bifurcation in the market where Starlink and Thousand Sails may diverge in areas where they invest. We see that Starlink covers only 52% of BRI countries, while BRI countries make up only 43% of Starlink's countries. And so we see that Thousand Sails and Starlink are complementary. However, there are several dimensions to consider. The first is a loss of international influence to other nations filling in coverage gaps, as well as autonomy over critical infrastructure. And so with these questions in consideration, we leave this open question of how should governments respond to the economic and security implications of national LEO deployments. And so I hope it's clear at the end of this talk that policymakers face really important questions when considering subsidizing commercial LEO deployments or deploying their own national LEO infrastructure. And the data I presented today provides nuance to how policymakers might think about some of these questions. Some of these questions include, should nations subsidize LEO networks under national broadband initiatives? And my data shows that it's actually unclear that LEO networks meet the objectives of these initiatives depending on how laws are interpreted. And in addition, we pose the question, should governments invest in deploying their own LEO infrastructure? And while some have talked about expanding internet access as a key goal of these infrastructures, for IRIS, it's unclear whether it will actually expand access relative to commercial deployments. For Thousand Sails, it seems clear that it will cover some regions of the world that are currently accessible via Starlink. And so perhaps this leads to a broader policy question of what purpose of national infrastructure will serve, as there are many other benefits, even if access may be overlapping. And so thank you all for coming to listen, and at this time, I'm happy to take any questions.